presentations this afternoon, there were a number of you raised the point about stories and narrative, and even the hypothesis in a clinical trial is a story. The American poet Maria Lukács says that the world is not made up of atoms, it's made up of stories. And there's a little plaque on the New York Public Library with this line on it. We've heard some amazing stories yesterday at the conference and today. And I'll take the question to Andrew, because Andrew started this off with stories and common myths and some of the problems on planet Earth. What stories should we be telling when we leave this conference this evening? And we're talking to people at home, we're talking to people back at the office, friends and family. What's the story that's important?
That's a good question. I think the most important story we should be telling is of the people that we've met here. I've been genuinely inspired, the networking event yesterday and just walking around today at just some of the people who are part of the Australian ecosystem across all different sectors, not just technology, across academia and so on, who are just truly doing amazing things. I've seen things at this conference that have blown me away. So I think for me the story is Australia has a huge opportunity to make a positive change in the world and to be a leader in technology, and we've got lots of success stories already, and we've got lots of folks who are on the way up, like Fleet Space and LX and all these really great companies that are truly relevant on a global stage.
In terms of scale, failure to scale expectations, Wendy, what are some of the stories that you've seen, the stories of successful scale, unsuccessful scale, and what might you take out?
I think a lot of the rhetoric when things don't scale is around frustration and the time it takes, and I think if you distill it back to some of the failure points in that process, it's been around underestimating the inertia around funding, the difficulty in meshing technology and people and implementing change. They're the things that bring these big projects unstuck. And I think it's just that lack of planning in some ways at the very beginning. The business case always looks fantastic in health because the numbers are so diabolical. So a couple of percentage point improvement in any direction looks awesome. But it's when you look under the hood and really tangibly work through how realistic is changing that funding model. GP salaries, GP reimbursement at the MBS code level has been flat for 4 years. So what makes us think that we're going to overhaul that overnight? And by the way, a health minister pretty much lost their job because of the election performance around health. So there's such risk and such aversion to it that you've got to plan for that, and you've got to be committed in the long term. And I think that's the other part where people pull up stumps too early because it hasn't worked or it hasn't achieved their lofty goal. But really, it probably needed to be a 5 or a 10-year investment and plan, and that, for a lot of businesses, is untenable, and it sort of excludes a lot of startups as well.
I also liked Alan's opener. It wasn't part of the PowerPoint presentation. It was extemporaneous, that we should all be evangelical scientists. And I think part of being an evangelist is also telling a story, but part of being a scientist is testing the hypothesis. Can you tell me, in the age of post-truth modernism, maybe when the monetization story is made up by the engineer, inventor, scientists, what's the role of that hypothesis test to fact check?
Do you know, I'm a little bit of an idealist, so I don't listen a lot to politics. And this post-truth is obviously totally contrary to where I come from. But the story, if we look to where we are, IoT is just one point in time today if we look at it today, but the evolution of knowledge has been so significant, and it's positively accelerating. It's an incredible period of time where we date right back and how quickly things have evolved. And you look at the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment periods where we started to develop the scientific method. Now's the time where technology is taking front page. And what I discussed was even a shift in the way that we look at the scientific method because we've got such good data. Now, we've just got to be careful that we're not just increasing the noise relative to the signal, which is going to make even more difficult in this post-truth world because people are going to draw facts from everywhere. But to understand exactly how we deal with that information, how we process it, is going to be incredibly important. And it's going to be vital to actually how we plan things out, not just medicine, but how we plan space travel and those sorts of things. So to shift from the political agenda and really look at evidence is going to be critical, and how we generate that evidence is going to be significant, given there's going to be so much more data available.
Jacob, you also opened with some statements about what should be humankind's scientific agenda today, and you closed with some discussion about clinical trials that you had made on the exoskeleton arm. Reflecting on your time in Israel, your time in California, tell me about what you think about the hype cycle, the role of the clinical trial for the technologist, and what stories come out from the laboratory to the real world.
I'll start with stories. So the Homo sapiens is the only animal that is telling stories. There is no gossip 101 in college. And the reason is that we do it because of who we are. So in the old days, we used to tell stories to ourselves and we believed them and faith evolved. But science is a story all by itself. In some respect, we are asking the world around us, what is your story? And through scientific method, we are trying to understand it. But something very interesting evolved recently through big data, because big data changed somehow the hypothesis-driven thinking towards let's look for correlation in this big data. So nobody will dismiss the scientific approach, but there is some alternative approach now, at least to gain some deeper understanding just from the data itself, and later through scientific method, we can understand that relationship or the principles behind it.
The last question I'll ask, and I'll throw this open to all four of you, and you can jump on it for whoever is most eager. Both yesterday and today, we've heard about the radical transformation in the amount of data that's available from sensors and from storage and from cloud computing and edge computing. In terms of health, well-being, and Internet of Things, in the health space and in innovation generally, there's this tension between open innovation and closed innovation, between intellectual property and secrecy and ownership versus free science and the Creative Commons, and some tension between competition and selfishness and sort of collaboration and openness. Either from your time working in California, Australia, Israel, or from your time in local domain with large sets of data and who owns the data. What do you think of the challenges in the future?
Me?
Anybody.
Well, I'm happy to go.
So I
spent, even though I'm on the good side now, I spent a bulk of my career as an investment banker, so I'm probably well versed in the issues there, and as a scientist as well. So I constantly wrestle with myself. But the issue is this: we have a society where we need to play by the rules, and unfortunately, some of those rules, especially if you're looking for funding and the like, have to be locked up by intellectual property because people are looking for a return on their investment. And I didn't make those rules, and none of us in the room did either. But it doesn't mean we don't need to play by it. We have a whole exchanges as NASDAQ and the ASX and the like that favour that sort of predicament, because the reality is, rightly or wrongly, you can't get funding for stuff translational unless it has intellectual property, because there aren't big groups providing that large amount of money to progress, say, a drug through phase 3 clinical trials. I wish it was different, but it's not. And we need to translate it in a particular way, and it's usually done in a corporate vehicle where the risks are balanced. And it's still a high-risk game, but it's just hard. and we don't have big groups funding basic research in the translational area where they'll fund drugs all the way through clinical development. So if we don't have that patenting position, rightly or wrongly, if we don't have it, we're not going to have state-of-the-art drugs in the future.
And maybe Wendy, from the collaboration versus monetization story, what are your thoughts on data?
I think, again, in health, it's such a sensitive area potentially, but there has been some great examples of collaboration in industry verticals. Like, for example, the private health sector came together to run trials in chronic disease management in the really, the 2% of the population that contribute 80% of the costs of health. And they did this connected care program, and it was spawned by, I think, Medibank originally, but then the other health funds, HCF, NIB, joined that bandwagon, and also the Victorian government, the state government, because they saw that if we all got behind this trial and showed that this new model of care worked, then perhaps then we can look further down the track. Now, for the health funds, they're not in the primary care space. They're actually legislated to not be in the primary care space, but it was a way of kind of testing the water and seeding the market, but also proving, a means of getting data around bigger population health issues as well. So that was an example of, people that are in a very competitive, or companies in a very competitive space, collaborating to try and drive at a goal, which was busting open a new model of care potentially, and proving the concept. So.
Very good. We've got the microphone in the back with Stacy. If you have a question, raise your hand. Perhaps identify yourself and your organization.
As leaders of the industry, doing to make sure that IoT doesn't actually make the world a worse place by concentration of power?
I'll just repeat the first part of that because the mic was off. You said this might not be the internet that we imagine, and what can we as leaders do to drive towards a greener pasture or a bluer sky?
So essentially, this is not so when we look at Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the internet, he says this is not the internet he imagined. He imagined this being creating a level playing field, but we've actually created a bigger skew of power today. The internet has created a bigger skew of power than a level playing field. How are we making sure that IoT is not going to be the same thing?
Who wants to take
Give it a crack. I reckon that's a great question. Tim Berners-Lee is definitely right to a large extent. The internet, when it was first conceived, it was a very utopian, anarchic concept. And there's no shortage of evidence sort of in recent years where power has become concentrated on the internet, and corporate interests have managed to prevail. Similar debates happening in the blockchain world at the moment. Blockchain is technology that was very anti-establishment in design, and it is now being, it's of great interest to both governments and corporates, and they're trying to put controls over it and make it private and protected and so on. So there's, with any technology, I think there's always this tension. There's maybe its original creators who might have a certain ideal, and then in order to scale it, you need to get the capital to be able to scale anything, right? I mean, even with the blockchain world, Bitcoin blockchain is completely open. There is no restriction on who can join the network, but there is ultimately an economic imperative to have that concentration of capital, so you can get cheaper devices to mine the blockchain at a cheaper rate, so you can make more of a profit. So the Internet of Things is a whole nother game now. The Internet of Things is, in fact, the opposite of the blockchain and the Internet itself in that regard, because the original version of the Internet of Things, 20, 30 plus years ago, was very much corporate owned and controlled. RFID tags were designed at MIT for corporate customers from the very beginning. But now the technology is becoming, in a sense, democratized. So will we end up with billions and billions of sensors that are deployed by citizens who would like to capture data and add value back to society somehow? Or will we end up with billions and billions of sensors deployed by corporates in a sort of value exchange situation, kind of like how Gmail gives you email for free, but then it takes all your data? Will all these corporates end up giving us sensors because it's better for us, but in actual fact, they're controlling all the data and all the value that's being created? So it's a great question, and that's my answer. I don't think there's an answer. We definitely don't know where it's going to go. It's another example of where we as a society need to understand what's actually happening with technology. We need to be aware of it, and one of the beauties of capitalism is that you vote with your money, and so we all have the opportunity to choose what sort of model we want the Internet of Things to end up as.
Is there another question on the floor now? Perhaps I'll take that theme of this isn't the internet we thought we were going to get and turn it to Jacob. You were speaking this morning about telemetric robots and surgery. The imagination perhaps 20 years ago couldn't nearly have been that we would be talking down a wire from one end of the world to the other end of the world controlling a robot. What might be the bright side outcome in the future of an internet that is doing more for health than what we might, what the general public may be imagining now?
I'd like to address the original question.
Okay.
So the term university is coming from the term universe. And as such, university is trying to encapsulate the human knowledge within a physical space, right? The internet is, to some extent, the same thing. It's the representation of the human knowledge virtually. It cannot be judged by being good or bad. It's what it is, right? So specifically with respect to your question, delivering healthcare along wires is dissemination of human knowledge across distances. In this case, it's a medical knowledge, but in a greater scale, it's knowledge. And access to knowledge should be free.
If you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll get the microphone to you.
Keeps me fit.
Thanks. Thank you. I found that really interesting, particularly the topics around collaboration in health. I think we touched on it a bit briefly as well, but I'm keen to hear more from your experience. What are some of the main, roadblocks users of health have? So considering both patients, healthcare providers, or even primary people that help out with the care. What are for them from a technology point of view? What are some of them, what's holding them back from adopting some of, IoT or using more of the data, other than some of the stuff that we talk about?
Let's go to Wendy for some of that failure to adopt technologies that are there.
Yeah, it's a complex question and a complex answer. I guess some of the factors around failure to adopt is truly understanding what the drivers of people adopting the technology would be in the first place. So if you think about, well, I don't honestly believe at this point a consumer would even, choose necessarily to be, even be thinking in that headspace when they enter a doctor's surgery to be told they needed oncology surgery or their prostate removed or whatever, that they wanted a robotic procedure versus a non-robotic procedure. But that said, if they did, then that would be a driver of it, and then that failure to understand that would, drive them to a different centre. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think people's general awareness around what options are available to them once they, hit a certain point in their health journey that becomes very complicated is well understood. So it's very contextual around, which GP you attend, where you have your testing done, where you get referred, and whose advice you're getting. So it can be multivariate. For those that are more tech savvy, they hop on the internet and they look at something like White Coat and they see which clinician does the most awesome stuff and they go there. For others, it's purely driven by the traditional referral pathways and that governs their educational journey. So there is a real, I guess to summarise, there's a real information asymmetry in health when it comes to being a patient or being a consumer of health, and technology has a really important role to play to destroying that asymmetry. But we're a long way from being there, and part of the inertia around that is the resistance to put up, for example, your surgical performance data on the internet. Okay, so imagine if every urologist in Sydney was to put up their blood loss rate or their rate of recurrence from prostatectomy online. If that was mandated, then suddenly you'd start to see the correlation between the men or women performing robotic prostatectomy versus not, and then as a consumer you could choose where to go. But we're not there yet today, right? And that's part of, so busting that information asymmetry is really important. I think that's sort of a start.
In consumer purchases, the person who is making the selection, person who's putting the money down on the table, and the person who is receiving the benefit is all the same person. But as Alan knows, you have the physician perhaps making a choice, the insurer, whether that's at a national level or a healthcare company, and then you've got the patient receiving it. This adoption of technology and barriers of technology, tell us about how that works in pharmaceuticals and how you see new technologies from the Internet of Things and from digitization in general maybe changing that in the future.
So to bring up something probably very topical, and it's going to sound, I guess, a little bit interesting if you haven't heard it before, but specialists have business models. And say an oncologist sees a patient, and if you've developed a drug where it's a particular other type of specialist has to deliver that drug, that oncologist loses that patient if they refer it. So there's two examples, Bexar and Zevalin, which came out, say, 15 years ago, which were great drugs. And but what happened was that the oncologist had to refer the patient to the nuclear med oncologist. And so they would lose cash flow and a whole bunch of other things, control of the patient during a process, when there were other drugs which were almost as good, pretty good. So instead of referring, they would actually keep the patient. So those drugs failed. And they failed because they didn't appreciate how the referring patient was the process of the referring patient, the business model. This is a significant issue for people generating new technologies, because if you don't fit into the business model, no matter how good you are, you will not succeed. People will not use your products. If you're way out, so if you've got a pathology product and it doesn't fit into a pathology lab straight away and you've got to send samples somewhere else, people are probably not going to adopt your technology, because the process is always iterative. It's not a massive jump. And if you don't fit in and then make change slowly, then you're not going to get in. Mm-hmm. So in areas that we've found where you can get around this sort of business model methodology, is that part of the focus for us at Clarity is to focus on children's cancers, because no one is going to hold up the process of a child getting good therapy. We know there's significant limitations in that area at the moment because there's such small numbers and big pharma doesn't want to be in the space to any great degree. So we've made the conscious decision to focus on that area with technology where we can more optimize dose, which is a little bit more difficult than say a prostate cancer person who has got, maybe a shorter time to live, 70, 80 years of age and near end of life, as opposed to a child where it's significantly important to reduce their side effects, that a pediatric oncologist will refer because it's about a long life of that, or a good life of that patient. So we've chosen a particular area to focus on purely around how do you get to adoption.
The question perhaps posed to Jacob as sort of the front end blue sky research. Alan's describing making a field of choice of child-focused cancer. When you're in the laboratory working with exoskeletons and with robots and mechanical things, how does the barrier to adoption of the technology influence what projects you and your research team and your collaborators at UCLA how you allocate your resources or which opportunities you think you might choose.
In the heart of every engineer, there is a little scientist hiding that wants to express itself or herself. And so for me, studying exoskeletons is obviously to deliver a better healthcare, but the indirect way of studying the brain. So the issue of brain plasticity is something that we don't understand very well. And so through helping people to recover from stroke, we are trying to essentially, under the table, trying to understand how the brain is reconnecting itself.
And I'll put the questions back out to the floor. If someone's got one, you can raise your hand. And if not, I'll put Andrew in the hot seat and go back to your thoughts about sort of the grand challenges that are there for humanity, the problems on planet Earth. How do you think that technology adoption and the feasibility of scaling up from small to big should affect our choices as a society about where we allocate resources, like on a national level of R&D or on in the market?
I think the ROI for technology is pretty good. I think most people would agree that spending money on technology generally gives you pretty good returns. However, I think there are always competing priorities. You know, if you're talking about resource allocation, far out. I mean, you know, how do you measure some of the things that we need to invest in? Like how do you measure empathy? You know, who's gonna do the business case for empathy? So I think there are problems in society and on this planet that 100% cannot be solved by technology, and they are extremely important for us to solve. You know, you've mentioned fake news. You've mentioned some of the political issues in the world. They all stem from the underlying social situation. So, yeah, technology. You know, Facebook might have had something to do with the American election. You know, might have moved the dial a little bit. But what about, you know, just the fact that people were still willing to vote for someone because ultimately they cared more about their own interests. You know, if you look at education, the problem with education is pretty simple. You know, education isn't valued enough for teachers to be paid how much they're actually worth to society. You know, and it's not the same in all countries. You know, the Nordic countries do a really great job of it. Teachers get paid really well, and it attracts the better students, right? So if you think about the multiplier effect of investing in education, yeah, I'd probably invest in some of that over technology. You know, I love technology, but I see it as an enabler, not as the solution. So that's probably my answer to a very difficult question.
Well, that was the answer from the Australian banker on the panel, but I'll go to these two gentlemen that have done some technology selection and innovation in California, and just ask from your point of view, when the investors are coming to the table, and we're talking about health and well-being and IoT and digitization, do you see cultural differences in risk appetite when the innovator entrepreneur is going out to the market in California or say Tel Aviv or Sydney? Is it the same across those different environments, or do you see a different? It factors in very strongly to adoption of technology, commercialization of technology, but how do you see the different environments in California versus Sydney versus perhaps Tel Aviv?
Well, VCs wants to make money. There is different flavors of how much risk they are willing to take. So West Coast VCs are willing to take higher risks than East Coast VCs. And so New York, for example, is trying to recreate Silicon Valley in the city. I don't want to predict the future, but I don't see that happening very quickly, because East Coast investors will not put money that they earn from generations through real estate on some internet idea. So it's also a cultural thing in terms of risk. I think that technology is an enabling element in essentially extending our life beyond what nature decided. And we can have a little questionnaire here. In the Western world, people are, a male will die at the average of 78 and a female at, I think, 82. So how many of you are willing to die at that age? How many of you would like to extend your life as long as you wish?
As long as I'm still happy.
Yes. Well, happiness is an issue, right? So define happiness. Well, I didn't see hands much one way or the other, so I don't know those who didn't raise their hands what you really want. But I think that one of the driving forces behind technology is to enable us to live as long as we wish.
And Alan, for a pharma company that is in stage 3 clinical trials,
A bit early, yeah.
coming up to it, what does the risk appetite look like, and what is the contrast in health, well-being, digitized data in California versus Sydney?
So I guess I've had the fortunate opportunity to spend the last 15 to 20 years on the back of raising money for technology companies, life sciences, devices, as well as general technology. And I think just to draw on one point, which is really significant, all the places around the world where I've raised capital, whether it's Australia, Asia, UK, Europe, or the US, every place is culturally different, and they play the game differently. And the East Coast, West Coast was a great example. To even have the same country work completely different. West Coast VCs are much easier to deal with than the East Coast VCs by far. But to give you another culture, especially in our space, sort of an understanding of culturally different areas. A few years ago, we were looking to trade a device company, Australian device company. And Australia, same as the US, you keep things really light as far as workforce because it's incredibly expensive here, and you focus on intellectual property. But the group that we were dealing with and this was a Chinese play, up in China viewed it completely differently and asked, how big's your building, how much real estate do you have, and how many employees you have? And when you discussed intellectual property, because the evolution of intellectual property has been quite significant in China over the last 15, 20 years, there was no real discussion of that. And their focus was a westernized company, a westernized face to a company that's in medical devices, and how many people and how much property. It was more about real estate and employees. And that cultural gap was so significant that obviously we didn't get the transaction done, despite having two parties keen to play. But that is an example of the broadness of it. But say Sydney, even Sydney and Melbourne. Melbourne's old money. It's about long-term relationships. It's about making people money if you're looking to raise capital. Sydney's a little bit bigger, so there's a little bit more flux going on. It's a little bit more dynamic, but still, if you want to be an investment banker, it's not about moving from another country to here and just setting up overnight, because it's about long-term relationships. It's about making people money. So if it's about just the raising money side, it's significantly different in every environment, even though you play by similar rules. But if you look at places like San Fran, it's the world on steroids when it comes to capital raising there, and people are throwing money into different things, setting up different instruments. So their technology development, if you like, evolution, is about how do we structure a different instrument of investment so we can actually make upside. Where in Australia, vanilla equity is really well accepted. What's your real value? What's the pricing? How does it fit? So it's horses for courses, depending on what where you are and what you're trying to do.
Now, there'd be time for one very quick question, if there was one last question coming from the floor.
Thank you. I would like to know if you have experience regarding how we could use IoT for patients that have Alzheimer's.
Patient with Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
Yes. Anyone want to take that, either a neuroplasticity, end of neuroplasticity question, or perhaps Wendy has a thought about emerging technologies that you've seen in the space?
Yeah, and just very loosely and very lightly, while perhaps some of my fellow panelists think of some ideas as well, there is some technology out there around the IoT space which is around tracking, for want of a better way of putting it. One of the challenges with Alzheimer's is that people disappear. You know, they get up in the middle of the night and they go for a walk and can't be found. So there are things like discrete, you know, wearables effectively that can help you locate your loved one, and that's, you know, not an uncommon problem in an application. And I can't give more specifics than that, but I know that that's in existence. A similar technology, similar platform is being used in babies, to, you know, newborn babies, to ensure that there are no mix-ups in hospital, and obviously that, you know, if they leave the hospital premises without permission, people know about and the right authorities are alerted. So it's more a security thing. It opens up a whole bunch of ethical and societal questions as well. I guess that sort of technology and how we deploy it.
I think some days I need one just so that my wife can zap me and tell me, wake up, Ashley. Look, we've had 4 great presentations today, this afternoon. Let's all thank Jacob, Andrew, Alan, and Wendy. One more round of applause.